In 1946, the United States Navy sailed nearly 100 warships into a remote Pacific lagoon and detonated 2 atomic bombs on top of them. The ships are still there, nobody has touched them since. And the question nobody fully answers is why? Not the obvious answer. Not the one about radiation, though radiation is part of it. The full answer involves a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a contamination problem that has never been solved, steel that is simultaneously too dangerous to touch and too valuable to leave alone, and a decision the international community made that essentially said some things are too important to history to ever move again. So let's go through it properly. Bikini Atoll is a ring of coral islands sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,500 miles from Hawaii, in what is now the Marshall Islands. In 1946, the United States government selected it as the test site for Operation Crossroads, the first peacetime nuclear weapons program in history. The idea was straightforward. The war was over. Nobody knew exactly what nuclear weapons did to warships. The Navy needed to find out. The people who already lived at Bikini were told their sacrifice would be for the good of mankind. They were relocated to Rongerik Atoll, 125 miles away. They were told it would be temporary. They have never been able to return. The fleet assembled for the tests was extraordinary. Nearly 100 vessels, American warships, captured German and Japanese ships, submarines, destroyers, and some of the most historically significant capital ships ever built. They were crewed by goats, pigs, and rats, fully fueled, fully loaded with ammunition, and sailed into the lagoon. The first test, called Able, was an airburst detonated on July 1st, 1946. A B-29 dropped the bomb from altitude. It missed its aiming point by around 700 yards. Several ships were damaged. None of the primary targets sank. The military considered this a disappointing result. The second test was different. The Baker test on July 25th detonated a nuclear weapon directly underwater, beneath the fleet. The effect was not what anyone had prepared for. A column of water over a mile high erupted from the surface of the lagoon. Radioactive spray drenched every vessel in the fleet. When the water settled, ships that had survived intact were now coated from waterline to masthead in contaminated seawater. The Baker test did not just damage the ships, it soaked them in radioactivity in a way nobody had anticipated and nobody knew how to undo. 4 of those wrecks tell you everything you need to know about why none of them have ever been recovered. The USS Saratoga was one of the first purpose-built aircraft carriers ever commissioned by the US Navy. 885 feet long, 43,000 tons, a veteran of the entire Pacific War with 8 battle stars to her name. She survived the Able test with minor damage. The Baker bomb detonated 500 yards away, underwater, and hit the Saratoga with a force that had nothing to slow it down before it reached the hull. 7.5 hours after the Baker test, the Saratoga slid stern first beneath the surface of the lagoon. Today she sits at around 160 feet of water. The aircraft in her hangar are still there. The bombs are still loaded. Divers have found dental chairs, a ship's bell, a Mark V diving helmet sitting exactly where someone left it in 1946. Everything exactly where it was when she went down. The IJN Nagato is perhaps the most historically significant wreck in the lagoon. This was the Japanese battleship from which Admiral Yamamoto personally ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. The most powerful battleship in the world when it launched in 1920. The first warship ever built with 16-inch guns. By the end of the Second World War, the entire Japanese Navy had been destroyed around her. The Nagato was one of the only Japanese battleships still afloat when Japan surrendered. The Americans brought her to Bikini as a trophy. She survived the Able test with only moderate damage. After the Baker test, she began listing slowly. Over 5 days, the list gradually increased, until on the night of July the 29th, with no crew and no one watching, the ship that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor quietly capsized and sank alone in the dark. Today, the Nagato lies upside down in around 110 feet of water. Nobody has touched it since. The USS Arkansas was a veteran of both World Wars. She had been at Omaha Beach on D-Day. She had bombarded Iwo Jima. The Baker bomb detonated 250 yards from the Arkansas. Witnesses described the battleship being struck as if by a hammer blow from directly below. The force of the underwater explosion appears to have lifted the entire vessel vertically before driving it down into the lagoon floor. The Arkansas sank in 19 minutes. She now rests nearly upside down at around 180 feet. Her 12-inch guns are still in their turrets. And then there is the Prinz Eugen, the German heavy cruiser that had sailed alongside the Bismarck on its doomed Atlantic mission in 1941. After the Bismarck was sunk, the Prinz Eugen had somehow survived the entire war. The British handed her to the Americans as a war prize, and the Americans sailed her to Bikini. She survived both atomic blasts, the ship that came through the entire Second World War, and 2 nuclear detonations, was eventually sunk by a slow structural leak that nobody could safely repair because of the radiation contamination. She capsized off Kwajalein Atoll in December 1946 and is still there today, propellers out of the water, lying on her side, still leaking oil into the Pacific nearly 80 years later. So why has nobody gone back for any of them? The radiation is the first answer, and the most obvious one. Right after the Baker test, the Navy sent decontamination crews onto the surviving ships. They scrubbed the decks, they flushed the hulls with water and chemicals. They replaced equipment. It made almost no difference. The ships were still registering dangerous radiation levels weeks later. The contamination had soaked into the metal itself, into the paint, into the wood, into every surface the radioactive water had touched. Of the roughly 90 vessels in the target fleet, only 9 were ever successfully decontaminated enough to return to service. The rest were eventually scuttled or abandoned. Nobody could make them safe. The wrecks sitting on the lagoon floor absorbed even more. The sediment around them is still contaminated. The corals growing on the hulls are still contaminated. Testing has found elevated radiation levels in the fish. Divers are permitted to explore the wrecks today, but they cannot touch anything, remove anything, or disturb the sediment. What is down there stays down there. But radiation alone does not fully explain it, because radiation decays, some of it slowly, some of it quickly. 80 years is a long time. You might reasonably ask whether the problem has not diminished enough by now to make some kind of recovery feasible. Here is the second layer of the answer. The steel itself. The wrecks at Bikini Atoll were built before the first nuclear test in 1945. That makes their steel what scientists call low background steel. All steel manufactured after the nuclear age began contains trace amounts of radioactive particles from atmospheric fallout. Pre-war steel does not. That makes it genuinely valuable for sensitive scientific instruments, radiation detectors, medical equipment, shielding in research facilities, applications where even microscopic amounts of background radiation in the material would interfere with measurements. There is a real scientific market for this steel. Several ships from this era have had their hull plates used precisely for this purpose. Here is the problem. The Baker test detonated a nuclear weapon directly underwater and then dropped a column of radioactive water back down onto every ship in the lagoon. The very test that sank these ships also contaminated the steel that might otherwise have made them worth recovering. You have pre-war low background steel that was then systematically drenched in radioactive fallout by a nuclear bomb. The salvage case and the contamination problem cancel each other out completely. Then there is the location. Bikini Atoll is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There is nothing nearby, no port, no dry dock, no shipbreaking facility, no heavy infrastructure of any kind. Any salvage operation would have to bring every piece of equipment across thousands of miles of open water. The cost would be staggering before a single piece of steel was lifted. And underneath all of that is something harder to argue with. These wrecks are graves. Men died on these ships during the test and in the decontamination operations that followed. The sailors who scrubbed those radioactive decks absorbed doses whose effects took years to fully appear. The Bikini people were displaced from their home and have spent decades unable to return to the islands their families had lived on for generations. The lagoon is not just a collection of interesting wrecks. It is a monument to what those weapons did and to everything that was sacrificed in the process of understanding them. In 2010, UNESCO designated Bikini Atoll a World Heritage Site, specifically because of its role in the history of the nuclear age. The lagoon is now formally protected as a site of outstanding universal significance. Raising the wrecks, even if the radiation question could somehow be resolved and the cost could somehow be justified, would mean dismantling a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The international community has decided, collectively and officially, that what is in that lagoon's too important to history to disturb. The Marshall Islands opened Bikini to divers in 1996. The wrecks have become some of the most famous dive sites in the world. The Saratoga alone draws divers from every country on Earth. The Nagato, lying upside down with its massive gun barrels pointing into the lagoon floor, has been named one of the top wreck dives on the planet. The lagoon is not forgotten. It is protected. The USS Saratoga still has her aircraft in the hangar. The Nagato is still lying upside down on her back in a Pacific lagoon. The Arkansas is still where that hammer blow from below drove her into the floor. The Prinz Eugen is still leaking oil into the ocean, 80 years after she capsized, refusing to completely disappear. Nobody has touched the Bikini Atoll wrecks since 1946. The radiation will outlast everyone alive today. The UNESCO designation will protect the site long after that. The atomic bomb did not just sink those ships. It made sure they would never leave. The contamination, the cost, the history, the legal protection, all of it compounding together into a situation where the most likely outcome, after nearly 80 years, is simply that those ships will stay exactly where they are, at the bottom of a remote Pacific lagoon, still loaded, still leaking, still sitting in the sediment from the tests that put them there. Some of the men who sailed those ships are still inside them. The goats and pigs are long gone, but the ammunition is still in the holds. The aircraft are still in the hangars. The diving helmet is still sitting exactly where someone left it in 1946. Nobody's coming back for them, and at this point, that seems about right. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments, and I'll make more of these. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss them, and I'll see you next time.